very early memory was of airmen walking down.
As then it was Furlong Lane.
Yeah, can you tell me that as though you've never told me that?
Oh yes, in the early days of the war, the airmen were paraded down Furlong Lane as it was, not Welfare Road, and were billeted on each house, and they stayed for a number of months. And my parents had one from Yorkshire. Then when he went, they had a couple from Essex who were married and were in the Air Force, obviously all based at Fradley, and they were taken to each house throughout the village, which people could accommodate.
Just explain to us again that Welfare Road didn't exist at that time.
That's right. Welfare Road didn't exist during the war. The theory was that the people, if they moved the name of the roads, the enemy wouldn't know which road was which. And Furlong Lane was known as Back Lane, and Welfare Road as Furlong Lane.
And did you also tell me that there weren't house numbers?
No, there weren't house numbers then. Each house had its own identification by a name. My parents' names were Fairhaven, others were Green Acres, and so on. And a lot of them had the name on a stone built within the house.
Can you remember, and if you can tell me about, the fact that you had an air raid shelter at the back of your house? Just tell me about that.
Yes, we just at the beginning of the war, the people that lived in a part of Welfare Road that built an air raid shelter along with my father, the neighbours, in concrete, and they placed and covered it all, then built it below ground, and they covered it with one small entrance, which we went in. I remember being carried in there as a child, and the men would stand outside. Some were on ARP service, and they could see all the bombers going towards Birmingham and Coventry. And also they tried to bomb Fradley Airfield, but they misjudged it and thought the canal was the runway, and there are bomb hole fails round Fradley where they did drop bombs, but fortunately they didn't hit the airfield, which was known as Lichfield base, not Fradley.
Yeah. So can you remember much about the air raid shelter being built?
No, not a lot. I can remember them digging it out. It was an old sand hole that Bannisters built houses in Welfare Road. They dug the sand and gravel out and used on the houses, which left a big hole, and they then levelled the bottom of the hole out and built the air shelter inside with a little smelly toilet on one end of it for use during the night.
Yeah. What about the fire service then? What can you tell us about? I mean, start off by telling us that there was a fire service in Orwell.
Yeah.
But then whatever you, and if you want to look at the photo, do.
Yeah. There was a fire service in Orwell during the war. It was known as the AFS, the Auxiliary Fire Service. They were based in the George and Dragon Yard. The one building remains today where originally it was just a pump which they used to pull out and take to push it basically to the fires. Then later on they had a tender which towed the pump around the fires, and they used to go to work in the day, and they slept in a round hut which was between the existing garage and the old building which is falling down in the Dragon Yard, and that's now manned for 12 hours from 6 at night till 6 in the morning. And in the daytime, if there were any locals and there was a fire call, they used to run to the fire and take the fire engine plus as many as they could get with it. Then they also run competitions for the AFS, and Orros was lucky enough to win one in 1941, I think it was. And if you can see that, those are all the locals that were in it, and I can name them all except one, but I don't mind if I put my glasses on. Starting there was Jim Hyde, he lived in Furlong Lane as it was. Joe Middleton, he lived in Daisy Fox Lane. Ron Ward, he lived in Main Street next to Joe Green and Barker's shop. Shirley Titterton, he lived in Park Road. Jack Hickson, who was the co-op manager, he lived in Main Street next to the chocolate factory. I don't know that one. That Charlie Fallowfield, who lived next door to the old co-op. Jack Taylor, he lived on the A38 on the Burton Road. Watty Walker, he lived in Back Lane. Jack Walker, he lived in Furlong Lane as it was then, That's my father, Walter Kirkland. That's yours truly. That is Ted Dolman, who also lived in Furlong Lane. And that is Arthur Ward, who lived in Main Street. And they were the crew that won the award at Little Aston Hall, and it was presented by Mrs. Lyons, who owned Scribona Cakes in those days. And there are pictures around the village where they paraded through Main Street with their trophy and me sitting on the tender pump, which, as I was one, and the engine, you'll see it at the back, was a Coventry Climax engine, and there's the pump. I sat on the top and they pulled it with ropes. And that was in approximately about 1942. Then my father was joining the Air Force, but a telegram came as he was mowing out the house to report to Stoke, to the fire service, and he became a full-time fireman at Lichfield, where they work 48 hours on and 24 off. And they went to a lot of the plane crashes with the Air Force to obviously put the fires out, and I think they had 1 or 2 horrific scenes.
Explain to me how the pump worked then.
Well, the engine was started by the driver of the pump, and it was usually my father. They run the hoses out to distribute the water, 4 men did, and 2 men run the pump out to the water, wherever it was, to get water to pull through the engine to fire the water hoses. And
were they called out very often then?
Not too much in the village, but they did again. If it was a fire aeroplane that crashed locally, they were called out. Yes, they were on the scene pretty quickly. But it generally to cover for bomb damage, which unfortunately Oris didn't get a lot of.
So I hope you don't mind me saying this, but could you just tell me that again? But starting with, they weren't called out very.
They weren't called out too often. It perhaps to a chimney fire or a small fire in the village, but on occasions, if the Lichfield Fire Brigade was stretched, they were called out to other fires or accidents, whichever the case may be.
Right, and just for our sakes, could you name them again, but this time without saying where they lived?
Yeah, by all means. Sorry, I didn't know.
No, it's all right.
Well,
we've got.
But I was trying to make it point. Sorry, you're not going. We're older as people.
Yeah.
Yeah, by all means. Right, when you're ready.
Okay.
Right, Jim Hyde, Joe Middleton, Ron Ward, Shirley Titterton, Jack Hickson, I don't know that one, Charlie Fallowfield, Charlie Taylor, Watty Walker, Jack Walker, Walter Kirkland, yours truly myself, Ted Dolman and Arthur Ward.
Right, thanks. Craft that was across hedges or something, you could walk underneath it. So
That's right.
Can you tell me that as though I don't know anything about it?
Yes. One of the air crashes I remember vividly was in off the A38 on the lane to Fine Lane crossing, which is now the Happy Eater. Sorry, beg your pardon, it's not. What's it called?
Well, it's closed down again, is it?
No. What's the one at Fradley? Fradley Arms.
Oh, Fradley
I'll start
Arms.
again, sorry.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, it's the Fradley Arms.
No, you start from the beginning.
Sorry.
Then. That's all right.
One I do remember vividly was one off the A38 into Fine Lane, which was across the road and sat on the hedges by the now Fradley Arms, where you could walk underneath it, and the plane was a Wellington, and the fire brigade were called to it, and it did land across there, and unfortunately the pilot died on that occasion, because my father visited as a member of the fire brigade based in Lichfield.
And could you just explain to me how it landed, where it was, how it came that you could walk underneath it?
But you could walk under the plane because the road was a little bit lower, and the plane belly flopped came down and dropped on top of the hedges. So therefore, the wings are on the hedge that side, the tail was on the hedge that side. So underneath, in the middle, was about 4 foot, and you could stoop underneath and walk underneath.
And did you do that?
I did, yes, because I wasn't very tall in those days, but I was privileged to go because my father had been and knew the security that was there at the time, which the security came obviously from Lichfield, or Fradley Airfield as we all know it as.
Yeah. Are there any other significant ones you can think of?
There was one, I didn't see it myself, but my auntie was a land girl at the Kerborough farm, where today is the craft centre, She was a land girl there, and one crashed just in the orchard trying to get back onto the airfield, and she ran out, and again the pilot unfortunately was dead, and there were other aircraft personnel that were also dead. It had come back badly shot but didn't quite make it back to base.
Right. Did you tell me, and if you did, tell me again, that there was a police station in the village?
Yes, I'm just thinking, just 1 second, I've got to think.
That's all right.
Yeah.
That's okay.
The first police station was in on, and then eventually it moved to Wellfield Road. You remember it being in, just going off record.
Yeah.
You remember it being, it's now a pair of houses, I believe, isn't it? But
What? Yeah,
but-
house, I think.
this one is it.
I think.
It's a very big house.
We didn't try just going off. We never found out it was up because you could have knocked it down and put 2 or 3 on there, and you can't do it perhaps now, but then you could have done. Anyway, that's another story. Yes, sorry, Graham.
Right. The other thing you told me, the other interesting thing you told me was what happened when the announcement was that the war was over. So can you tell me that again?
Yes, my mother was listening to the radio on the morning the war said the war was over, and I was sent round to a little bungalow in Welfare Road, 2 doors from where I lived, and asked the lady, Mrs Davis, to raise the flag because the war was over. And I just picked the lady across the road, who then was Mrs Powell, was asking the same question. Then a few days later, there were parties in the street to say that the war was over, and everybody thoroughly enjoyed it.
Good. Right. Great. That you said all farms and builders. Just tell me what sort of a village it was in those days.
Just thinking. Yeah, the village of Orres in the war, or before the war, but I don't remember that much before the war, was always, the village people were nearly all employed in the village. There were a number of farms and builders in the village, and also Orres Mills, which employed a lot of people. And if you start at the top of the village, there was Manor Farm, which was in those days the people called Mycock, and then you came into Main Street, there was Malabar's, and then there was Tom Smith's, there was Jack's Winfield, Mansell's, which is now where the fish and chip shop is, Vivian Sinfield, which was the other side, opposite the side of the road to the chip shop. There was a farm there as well. And then round in Essington House farm was Tom Mellor, or Tom Mellor's father as it was in those days. And that was in the village farms. And there were builders starting to get the top of the village. There was Mays, there was W.E. Ward's, there was Ravers, there was Kent's, and there was Bannisters in the village. They employed a lot of people from the village plus people from out of the village.
Good. Now I know that you said this was that near the water.
That was. I mean,
was it?
if you're just going to, I mean, you played cricket, didn't you? Did Bill
I did,
play
but
then?
no,
Did Bill
didn't.
play then?
No.
When did you start playing cricket?
Oh, 1980.
Oh no, it was right before then. Bill played then. Let's go back.
Yeah.
I'm 73. When I first played, I was about 15. So how many years? That would be after the war, wasn't it? 1950. 1950. There was, the cricket team then, and it was cricket and tennis. And Mr. Shemmons lived in your house, but that's going off the. I mean, the cricket club has been going a number of years, but when I got involved, I was a scorer before I became a player, if you like.
Yeah.
And the Orme Cup was started in 1948, which was the local lockout for the village, given by then President Edgerton Orme. That's what it's called, the Orme Cup, and still is an Orme Cup today. And it's the same cup. And all the villages played, and there were 1 or 2 characters that played for the cricket club in the old days that I remember, especially Bill Simpson, who was owned the fish and chip shop, was a booker's runner and cut your hair as well. And also, if you're lucky, you could have snuff to go with it.
Yeah, somebody was telling me, I don't know who it was, somebody was telling me about him playing cricket.
Rick Tweakham, but he didn't go for long. But yes, his interests were, he was treasurer, and he was. He lived for the cricket builder. Oh yes, he did a lot for the cricket.
Yeah, I'm just now sort of trying to think about the facilities, not just shops but other facilities in the village, particularly in Main Street, that is no longer there. So I'm thinking about the fact that there were two shops that had cafes behind them, both of which did wedding receptions.
That's right.
So can you tell me, as though I don't know anything about it, can you tell me about those?
Yeah. In Main Street in Orrowus, there were a number of shops, a number which are not there today, and there were two shops, which was then Dalmans, who had a cafe behind, and Horsley's Cafe, which was next door to Leavesley's, which was then Ivy Garage, which sold cars and petrol. And those people, there were weddings there, receptions there, and also in Main Street was a cobbler's shop, and a chap named Mr. Hill ran that, and next to it was a little shop called Williams's, Teddy Williams, who sold cigarettes. And also in Main Street, the other shops was a chemist shop, which was the White House opposite the existing chemist. And what else was it? And there was also two fish and chip shops, which again was Bill Simpson's, which was at the top end of Main Street, opposite number 156. And there was one which now is Nick Collins's yard, which was a chip shop known as Mar Taylor's.
Was there if there was, tell me about a dress shop.
Yes, there were two dress shops on us at one time. There was Mrs. Wright's, which was a wooden building, which was next door to Coates's, the butcher's. And then when the new chip shop area was built, there was a haberdashery shop there as well, under the name of Simpson, which then, when they retired, became the chip shop in Orrowus in 1963, I think it was.
And so would that haberdashers have been there round about the time of the war?
Oh yes, it was there before the war as well. The Wright family. I said, no, I don't remember it being transferred from the Wright family. When the Wrights retired, it was sold and knocked down to give access to their house and to the cottages at the rear.
Were there any other significant? There was the Paul Pry, wasn't there, where there was a mortuary or a cold slab?
Yes, that's right. In Orrowus, it's recommended for both pubs. There was starting at the top of Village Game was the Navigation Inn, and you came down into Main Street was the Georgian Dragon, and years ago, before my time, there was a pub next to the Georgian Dragon called the White Hart Hotel, and that is why the Mews was known as the White House Mews, and that was the Builder's Yard. There was a pub in the Crown Inn, which is opposite the chapel, and you came down into Main Street then, and there were the William IV in William IV Road, and there was also a pub which I don't remember, known as the Royal Oak, which was opposite Horsley's shop, and then there was the Paul Pry, which was on the A38, and in that was the village mortuary, which they held different functions in the Paul Pry Hotel, plus inquests were held there on the deceased.
Right.
Incredible.
I mean, because the slaughter, you know, the slaughterhouses, wasn't there? You know, the one in Fox Lane, the one at Coates's, that White, you know, Coates's office is now slaughterhouses. I used to get as kids when we went to school to pull on the end of the rope to pull the bees' heads down to the floor so they could shoot it. Well, poleaxe it in them days. That's where the whole thing of poleaxes came from, wasn't it? It was a vicious thing.
Don't you tell us that? We might or might not.
Okay, carry on, let's record it.
Is it?
Yeah.
In Orrowus again, Orrowus is self-sufficient with its farms, but also...
So just start that again because my watch beeps.
Start again?
Yeah.
Yes. Also in Orrowus, there were two slaughterhouses, with Orrowus having farms, became self-sufficient in a lot of cases, and there was Coates's slaughterhouse and Collingwood's, but Collingwood's was used for different slaughtering to Coates's was used for meat, and the present slaughterhouse, if you look into Coates's yard, there's a white building with an asbestos roof, when originally that was a thatched roof, and they used to kill the cows on a Monday, and as we were walking to school, and often occasions, they would get us help pull the rope to pull the beast in for slaughter with a poleaxe, but in later years with a humane killer.
What did they do? How did they poleaxe him? What was that?
They pulled his head to the floor, and it was like a pick, and they used to swing the axe, and you see the centre of the skull there. They pierced it in there before they put the pithing cane in to puncture the brain.
Right. It's an X certificate.
Oh, that bit is, yeah. I mean, it doesn't bother me. I mean, I can get a Nick, my eldest son. I mean, Colin was playing, he's to Cyril, I know. Cyril Wright, he lives up the road from you. No, Cyril. He lives in the house backing onto the school.
Mm.
And he was the slaughterman and he owned it in the end. And he used to get the cow's eyes for Nick. And when Nick wants some eyes for school, I know my dad will get me them. We went up and he cut the eye and showed him how it all worked, the corn and everything. And oh yeah, it was. But I mean, you're not recording this. This Collingwood slaughterhouse is known for killing the dead ones. If an animal broke its leg or anything like that, it was taken to that slaughterhouse and killed, and the meat was passed for human consumption when the meat that was not fit was taken away. So if it broke its front leg, perhaps they'd use the hindquarters and one forequarter. That would go into the food chain. And that came to welfare road, some of that, but you won't talk about that, do we? But that's how the farming lived. Oh yeah. I mean, a farmer, how many cattle did a farmer had got? Not in them days, did they? But Collingwoods all kill it for them, you know. Or it had broke its leg or asked questions. So, but what I'm trying to think what else was in Main Street. That was only the mill really. It was a hive of industry, wasn't it? So, I mean, you've got most likely millmen that can tell you more about it than I can. That it was a mill yard. I mean, Jennifer Owen's father worked at the mill. And people at Mill End. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing gone. Unfortunately, it's gone from Orrus. It's not coming, has it, you see? I mean, the mill was employed a lot of people and always had the best vehicles, the best lorries. And, you know, it was a institute, really. But I don't know if you've read the history of Orrus, but it goes back to Norman times. And the Roundheads were there and there's blokes been hung there. Well, it was quite a place, because it was obviously a cotton mill in the years to come. Do you remember it there being the mill, obviously, in your time in Orrus?
I can remember it being a tape mill and a pig food.
It's always been a pig food, always been a cattle food mill. And remember the gates where they used to turn the water under the bridge into the mill stream to drive the mill wheel? They're still there today, the mill. Well, the under stream is under the mill. If you buy the bottom flat, you can have a glass floor and see the water going through.
What about public transport? Handford's buses, you mentioned.
Yes. During the war and after the war, the ordnance factory at Branston employed people out of the village, and Handfords, who were based at Barton Turns, which is now Taylor's Transport, used to come into the village and take the people to work at Branston factory. And they also took, after the war, took the children from Orrus School to the swim baths in Burton on a Tuesday or a Friday afternoon, whichever class was going. So that Handfords were part of the village, but again, and they also run trips to Bournemouth to weekly holidays, and just after the war. But then eventually the Handford family died, and it just disposed of.
So was that a village family then?
No, it was a Barton. They were Barton people, and there's Ted Handford and his son, young Ted, and they run the transport. And a lad out of Kings Bromley called Morris Atkins used to be one of their mechanics and drive for them, and his brother still lives in Orrus, but Morris unfortunately died a few years ago. But his widow is still in the village.
Was there a laundry?
Lichfield Laundry, Orrus did have a laundry collection by the Lichfield Laundry, which came once a week, came door to door and collected the laundry. And also we had baker deliveries in the village with horse and carts just after the war. The co-op had a horse and cart, and the bloke that drove that was named Bill Causer. His son lives in the village. At Garrett's of Lichfield, they also had horse and carts which came into the village, and that named Mr Jackson was the baker in the village then. There was also a little firm from Barton called Showles, and Tom Showell used to come into the village with the van, and he delivered bread door to door. And we also had Peaches the milkman with a horse and cart, and they delivered milk door to door straight out of the churn into the bucket and then ladled into the jug or whatever you wanted into. But in later years they had a javelin van, and the son took it round after the war. But Mr Peach always went round on his bike with 2 5-gallon cans, 25-gallon cans, and delivered milk door to door again. Plus in later years the co-op delivered milk into the village, but theirs was bottled, and they left your milk check ready for the milkman to tell you how many pints you required. And you prepaid for the checks at the co-op. So he just collected the cheque, and each cheque represented a pint of milk.
I can remember that. So what this man, Mr. Prince, did you say, who went round on a bike with 225?
Peach.
Mr. Peach.
Mr. Peach, yes. It was Peach's milk round, and Mr. Peach went round on a bike with 2 cans with lids on, and he put his bike down the cans, and he came to your door. How many pints would you buy today? Or a half pint, and he ladled into a jug or a basin, whatever you wanted it put into. And his daughter also worked on, Elsie Peach. She also worked on it for a while, and his son Albert worked on it until he retired. Then the local, I think it was Midland Dairies, then took over, and from then onwards. But unfortunately, Albert doesn't exist anymore.
So these urns were just attached to his...
No, they were on handles like a bucket, like a
Yeah.
big bucket with a lid on.
Yeah.
Maybe explain it more. And that was only ladled it into your receptacle, whether it was a jug, basin or whatever. He came door to door. But the co-op were a bit more upmarket, they'd got bottles.
Right, lovely. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Ian.
Can't think of the lessons. I mean, you
Well,
can go
just
back,
look-
and I think we paid him £100 for it, I think. And Ron Rowe, no, RF Rowe, and that we had in one of his mother's, she's got a farm, but it was on the A38, wasn't much of a farm. Trailer, and us lads, we were young lads, I wasn't married then, and we took it down, moved on his mother's trailer, put it from the cricket club, because originally the cricket hut was on the other side of the ground where the nets are, and the scorebox. That's where the original cricket pavilion was. And then we moved it at weekends through the winter, and we got it all on. We had paid to have the electric put in, we paid to have a tank put in for the sewerage, and 2 old cricketers, George and Ernie Heathcote, built the toilet block for us, and that's where the first one we had. And then we had a bar in there, and then that's when the cricket club really took off. And after that, we had the ground levelled, because it all used to be hollows and ridges, hollows and humps. I had that levelled, and that's why it's a level playing field today. So that was on old Arthur Hood. When you don't, if you scored, you were let in. Oh God, were they strict? But I think it was all wrong. And they just opened the door. There was the dressing room, 2 big doors. And when you went in, you could see them getting changed. If you opened the door, somebody could be getting changed, and nobody bothered. And the groundsman there in Arthur Hood, who had his little sit-on mower, and we had to pull the roller. There was no mechanical roller then, and you were told after the game you roll the wicket, and in the week after practice you could roll the wicket, had to roll the wicket, and that's when Norris Cricket Club really took off. And in 1974-75 I had a fire, and that's when the brick one was built. I drew the plans. Again, we got grants and money from all out, and the insurance money. We built the present pavilion today.
Could do one on the cricket club.
Could do all
Frank
loads of
Watson.
things, couldn't we?
Frank Watson is pretty good. I mean, Frank's pretty good. He was there then.
Richard Walker's done a history of the cricket club, hasn't he, for his A-level?
Has he? Oh, good.
He did it for...
You
for
you
his
got
A-level
Norman Stubbs'
courses.
book?
What, the history of Orioles?
Yeah,
Yeah, I've got that.
piece in there, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, you're in it, Ian.
Oh, I remember. But there was a bloke. I mean, in the old days, Orris Creek was always well known. But I don't know. We're just going off cricket. We're working at Burton Gents Cricket Club, or Burton Cricket Club. I mean, that's an old, very old building in Burton, and they say that's one of the first cricket clubs in the district. Gone back, it was Burton Gents, and by God, to get a fixture with them, nearly had to be God, because it was gents. So Burton, when cricket in the old days was gentlemen and players.
Where's the red light? What do you remember about the builders in the village when you were younger? You've just been looking at the map with me.
Yes, there were a number of builders starting at the top of the village with Kent's, then Mays in Mays Alley, and then down into Main Street next to the George and Dragon was W.E. Ward's, known as the White Hart Works. Then we moved farther down Main Street and there was Kent's, where the small hairdressers is but is now redundant, and carried on to came to Bannisters, and in later years Arthur Ward set up the business of building again. Then you went on to the old A38 towards Burton. There was another small builder called Mr. Rayworth.
And where were Kirkland's then?
Kirkland's weren't builders. My father was a partner in the firm of W.E. Ward.
Oh, right. Yeah. And what sort of work did... no, first of all, when did Kirkland start up then?
RJK Construction was started in 1991. RJK Construction was.
And where did you work before that?
I worked for Bailey Construction, the NHBC, National House Building Council, took the IDC, and then I started my apprenticeship at W.E. Ward's when I left school at 15 as apprentice carpenter and joiner, and I stayed there and I got my sitting gills. At 21, when I did the final year, I was in the RAF for 2 years doing my national service.
When did you have your first pint?
When I was about 17, 18 in the outdoor at the George and Dragon.
Can you remember how much it was?
1 and 8 pence, I think it was.
Also, I've been told that you were a keen cricketer. Can you tell me anything about the cricket teams in the 1950s or thereabouts?
Yes, in the 1950s the cricket ground was there and the houses weren't built then, which is known as the estate where your good self lives, and the fields were went up and down, undulations, and the same onto the cricket pit. Cricket square was very flat, but the pavilion was on the opposite side of the ground, where now the swings and that are at the moment, and the practice nets. And there was a separate tea room, a small hut that kept the mower and the roller in, and then there was also the pavilion changing rooms were one shed split into two. The gents' toilet round the back was just a trough, and the ladies' toilet was just an Elsom or a bucket. And the groundsman name in those days was a chap called Arthur Hood, who wouldn't let you nowhere near into the enclosure. But over the years, as I joined and played, we moved across onto where the present pavilion is. We had a wooden pavilion which was given to us by Mr. Audley Malabar, upon permission of Mrs. Rowe. She let Ron the tractor to move it from Audley Malabar's yard behind the Crown to the cricket. And it was erected by all the members, mainly Peter Watson, Frank Watson, Malcolm Markham and myself. We used to work weekends till 10 o'clock at night on a Sunday, and then we built it. But then in 1975 we had a fire, and then the present brick one was built, which I drew the plans for, and our chairman at that time was Richard Hill, who was the planning chairman at Lichfield District Council. So we got planning permission within a short time, and through the following winter we built the present one which stands there today.
And John decorated it.
Correct.
Right, we've answered the next question as well about the changing facilities. Can you name any of the cricket team in the 1950s?
Yes, Jeff Watson, Peter Watson, Norman Stubbs, Frank Jones, Ern Heathcote, George Heathcote, Vic Heathcote, Jack Jones from Fradley, Norman Watson from Fradley, and then later on Peter Watson, Frank Watson, Malcolm Harcombe, John Bladen, Eric Jones, Tom Smith, and the umpire was Mr. George Thomas, and there was another umpire called Mr. Stubbs, who was not relation to Norman Stubbs, lived in Park Road.
Very good.
And also Tom Green was a player from Fradley.
What age did you start school at the village school?
I was 5 years of age at school, which is now houses at the top of the village by the church.
Yeah.
And my first teacher was Mrs. Lakin, Miss Lakin, and she lived at Orgreave on a farm, which is now the present gas station.
Yeah. What was your headmaster's
Mr.
name?
Lane was Mr. McKnight, and he retired and lived in Fox Lane when he retired, in the house opposite Furlong Lane. And his wife was a teacher, so was Mr. Norman Stubbs, Mr. Jones, Miss Ward, who was a Liver Village person, and Miss Harrison from Burton, and Mrs Constable, which was also a local lady.
And what age did you leave school?
When I was 15.
15. What activities did you do while you were at school, recreation-wise?
Well, we played cricket and football on which is now the graveyard at the church. We used to walk down the canal side to Maze Bridge, as we know it as, and into the field, and that field there was our playing field where we played football in the winter and cricket in the summer.
What about swimming and canoeing?
We had swimming. We used to take to Burton and Baths on that was a Wednesday or a Friday afternoon by Handford's transport from Barton and Needlewood, and our teacher used to take me was Mr Jones.
This was all from school, yeah?
Yes, it was, yeah.
Yeah. What about recreation of a night time when you were a teenager?
Well, there was very little actually. In the summer you could go across to the cricket and play cricket. At one time I was a member of the church choir, and for a few years, when I was about 12 to 14, we had a certain curate called Mr Finch who did run a choir club, and that was all we had really. It was you stayed in, you didn't go out.
Yeah.
And that was, unfortunately, there was no other activities in the village.
Yeah.
Until the summertime, there was Orow's show and different things, but generally it was all done in the village, or you went out of the village to the pictures. We did have, during one period, we had every Saturday night, Clifton Cinemas used to come and show pictures in the village hall.
I've heard that that's by what we call the flea pit now.
That is correct.
Yeah. Are there any particular stories that you can remember about being at school?
Yes, my first day at school, I went in a pair of grey trousers, grey shirt and red pullover, and I had my fingers wrapped for talking by Miss Lakin. We used to also do gardening at school as well, and Mr McKnight used to take us in the garden. We had a lesson in the garden, digging and planting seeds, and that's how I more or less got interested in gardening. Plus my father was a keen gardener, and a couple of my uncles.
Where did you live then?
I lived then I've always lived in Horace all my life. We lived at number 23 Wellfield Road. Until I got married, we moved here.
That was
Furlong Lane.
Furlong Lane then?
Yes, it was known as Furlong Lane in those days, and in the back lane is now Furlong Lane, because they say it was done during the war so that the Germans wouldn't be able to pick the addresses up or pick any mats up.
Oh, that's the reason, right. So that's all the questions I've got in to do.
Oh, it's very kind of
Yeah.
them. Are you happy with that?
Very, yes.
Was it as a miracle for first day at school?
Pardon?
What?
Yeah, I did, yeah, Miss Lakin.
Get me
You didn't know that then, did you? Can you tell me about the shops in the village in between the 1930s and the 1950s?
Yeah, so we started at Main Street, top of Main Street. There was Dickinson's shop, which was an off licence, my Mrs Dickinson, and previous to that, which I don't remember, was where Mr Leasley first started his business, selling bicycle wheels and tyres. That was there. Then you moved down to which is now Rainbows, which was the old co-op. That was there for years. Mr Hickson was the manager, and his assistants were Dennis and Doug Pickering and Fred Smith. They all lived in the village. Then we came farther down, then, and on the left-hand side, opposite the George and Dragon, was the chemist shop. And it was the proprietor was Mrs Parsons, and just next to the post office there was a little sweet shop, and Mrs Ford ran that shop. Then we come back into Main Street. You've got Peter Coates's, which has been there a number of years. Opposite there, Peter Coates's, was Mrs Dolman's shop, and behind there they had a cafe which all the cyclists used to congregate in midweek and on a Sunday. And we moved farther down the village then to before Hart's Garage, which is now the hairdressers. There was a shop there, Baker's, called Turner's, which closed, I believe, just before the war. Then we went on then to Mr Green's shop, which was just in front of Barker's shop, and the bloke named Joe Green and his wife run that. Then there was Mr Barker's, Bob Barker, and his son John ran that one. Then we went farther on, there was a Horsley's shop and cafe and tea room on Main Street, and opposite there was Mr Cowling's cycle shop and ironmongery, and next to that was Teddy Williams's cigarette and sweet shop, next to which was Cobbler Hill, and previously, years ago, there was a pub on the corner called the Royal Oak, which was stood opposite the Paul Pry, which was demolished in 1961 when the A38 was made into a dual carriageway.
And the Paul Pryor was opposite?
Opposite on the A38,
Yeah.
which was a Bass house, and also in the Paul Pry was the local mortuary where anybody was killed or whatever was laid on the slab, coal slab.
And what about the cobblers? That was...
The cobblers was Mr Hill, and that was then when he died it was made into a dwelling.
So then I've got down on my map, Mary Perkins and her brother Ken had a small holding, so we know
Yes,
of farms.
that was in the same yard as the estate, Litchfield Estate. Lord Litchfield's estate men used to work in there, bricklayers, carpenters. Joe Pye was one of the carpenters that did the work on the properties owned by Lord Litchfield.
And on the other side of the road, can we go through the farms then in the
Yes.
village?
We start again at the top of the village, was Manor Farm, and I first remember the first person that owned it before the Malabar family was a Mr Mycock, who had a son Reg that wasn't interested in farming, and then that farm was sold on when he retired. And you come down into Main Street, past the co-op on the right was Tom Smith's farm, and opposite side of the road is the one you just made about the Perkins. Then there was Malabar's on the corner of Fox Lane and Main Street. Then you went along next to Coates the Butcher's where those detached houses stand. There was a farm there owned by Mr Jack Swinfield. And then where we moved farther along, on the left hand side where the chip shop and the paper shop are, was another farm which was owned by Mr Tom Mansell. He sold that and moved to Overley Farm, Overley Lane. And then on the opposite side of the road there was another farm owned by a gentleman named Viv Swinfield, who was Jack Swinfield's brother. Then you went round into Park Road and Mr Mellow's is the other farm in the village.
I've got a farm owned behind the chip shop that is now owned by Mrs Turner.
No, that was Mrs Turner, was Mr Mansell's mother-in-law. She owned it before he did. It was on the site of the chip shop now.
You haven't mentioned anything about Mark Taylor's.
Mark Taylor's Cafe was in, that's right, in Main Street. It was a wooden building, but is now the electrical and alarm shop.
Nick Collins is, yeah.
And
yeah.
Margaret and Miss Dolman, John Dolman's, that used to have the potato merchants, his sister worked for Mrs Thomas.
That's covered all of those then. Tell me something about a butcher's boy.
When I was a lad of 7, I went to Coates as a butcher's boy. They were friends of my friend. I used to take the carrier bike around the village on a Saturday and deliver the orders. And on school holidays, I went in the vans with Len Salt, Backer Millington, which is known as Arthur Millington, and Tom DeRose around Elford, Fradley, Eddingale, Kings Bromley, and all the areas, Witchner, and all the lying areas as a butcher boy in the van.
At 7 years old.
At 7 years old. And I finished that, and I used to help them. Mr Coates on a Saturday afternoon used to fetch pigs in for people to kill for their own use in their house. He used to fetch them on a Saturday, kill them on a Monday, and I used to go with Peter's father around the areas to fetch these pigs in. And often the ladies went in the house, they cried because the pigs had been taken away to be slaughtered.
A Mr Brian Weaver.
Yeah,
Can you tell me about him?
yeah, Mr Brian Weaver lived in Orrowes. They lived in Mays Alley, top of Mays Alley, where Mays the Builders were, and they then moved into other part into Fox Lane. But Brian went into the Air Force when he left school. He flew in the Air Force fighter planes, then went into civil airlines. When he retired, he became a vicar and is retired as the vicar of Four Oaks, Sutton Coldfield.
And came and did a talk at the WI.
Indeed he did, yes.
Yes. Where was the undertakers in the village?
The undertakers, there were two. There were Mr Cartwright at the bottom of Kent's Bridge. He was also an undertaker and a wheelwright. And when we went to school, we used to see him making the coffins on some days and wheels on the other day. Then another 200 yards on the right-hand side in the tall house next to Prospect House was another undertaker named Mr Kent, which was Frank Kent's father.
And the blacksmiths?
Blacksmith shop was, as I remember it, used to take the horses in. We went to school in the morning or at night. You'd see the horses being shod. It was owned by Mr Bradford, who lives in number 1 Park Road, which is next to Gaskell's Bridge.
Oh, Richard Evans' house now.
No, the other side of the road.
On the other side, yeah. Can you tell me anything about Allruis Mills and the history of it?
I can't tell the history of it, as when I know it, it was always been a mill, which employed, I would say, 50 or 60 people. They had a fleet of lorries, 4 what they call the Foden lorries, or the big ones, that went each day to Birkenhead, took loads of corn up and bring loads of different materials back. They were processed in the mill, and then they got a fleet of small lorries that delivered to all the farms in the area. And Mr Orme himself owned a farm at Blakenhill in Barton under Needwood.
This is Mr George Orme
His father.
that lives in the village now.
His father, Mr
His
Edgerton
father,
Orme.
right.
Mr Edgerton Orme. At one time there was also another director, which was Mr Durose, but after the years he came out and bought Shenston Mills and run Shenston Mills.
Where is Pyford Brook Farm or garage?
Pyford Brook Garage, as you go out of Allruis today, it is still a garage, but it was owned by Mr Taverner, who, by the way, was secretary for a number of years of Allruis Show, and they used to run a taxi service, and Charlie Wood and Les Edwards were the taxi drivers, and they used to have the old Rolls Royce cars.
And lastly, can you tell me about Miss Hunter?
Miss Hunter had a school which was known as the Alley by Dickinson's shop, and it was a private school, and quite a few. Peter Coates was one, and I think that Diane from the post office was another one that went there. I might be wrong, but I think she went there as well.
And this is what we know as the old schoolhouse?
Yeah, where
No.
Dr Shake lives now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we've covered everything, haven't we?
Well, there was another school years ago before, on the end of, if you went down William IV Road and went straight across into those black and white cottages, where the chairman of the, or past chairman of the Irish Parish Council lived, and Derek Hopkins, that used to be a school there, they tell me, many years ago.
Is this by where you call the dock?
Down the dock, down Park Road, yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything else you can think of?
I've covered it. We nearly stopped breathing.
Can you tell me where, as a child, you used to play cricket?
Yes, when we were at school, we played cricket. We used to go down the canal side, I don't know which is the graveyard, and play cricket and football from school. We were allowed out in the morning, and we used to have lessons, I think it's twice a week. For now, we were allowed to have games. But also, when I was a young chap, we used to play, and I was at home, and I was at school, we used to play at night in the Pony Field, which is now Poppy Gardens.
And what's to do with the slang? What's that?
The slang was a note we used to know as a peace line, which went off the old dark lane. And there were 2 cottages. When the present dark lane was constructed, before that, it went closer to the cottage that still remains there. And there were 2 cottages that were knocked down, 1 or 3 cottages that were knocked down. One was a Mr Prince, a Mr Titterton, which is Mr Titterton's brother that lived in the other one, and a bloke named Harry Lakin, who was a painter at W.E. Ward's way before the war.
Can you remember when Muffin the Mule was born?
No, I can't, I'm sorry. I knew Weatherfield where he was, and I knew that he died there, but I couldn't give you any information on that.
Nobody seems to know
No,
how old
no.
he was. They think he was
I
about
can tell you
40
who will
odd.
know it. His son. Their son lives next to where the redundant hairdressers is. Not one on the left of there. He owns that, all that anyway.
Burns Mace.
Burns Mate.
Yes, yeah. That's it, I can't think of anything else. Can you tell me anything about the railway?
Yeah, the railway. Well, I remember the railway at school. We used to go occasionally to Burton, my mother, on the train to Burton. And in the yard there used to be a station yard where Princes had the coal delivered, weavers, and previously, and all the cattle. I remember the cattle and the milk being moved from there. And they tell me before the war, W.E. Ward used to have all the cement, bricks come into there, and they used to have horse and carts which took it from the station to their yard in Main Street. And you got a shed called Ward's Shed, which is now gone. It was down Ridgett's Lane, which Ridgett's Crossing has moved. And Sonny Dolman was the main driver on the horses. My father and him, who lived at Ridgett's Crossing house, used to race them over the railway crossing at night when they went in the field.
Can you tell me anything about anything naughty that you ever did? Like I heard something about something to do with smoking.
Yes, I was caught smoking on the school bus by one of the schoolmasters when we were going swimming with another couple of pals. Mick Watson was one, and we got sent off the bus. And we used to put, another thing we used to do in the getting towards bonfire night, was buy penny bangers from Dickinson's shop, drop them in the canal, and they exploded under the bridge and made of an echo. But one night, P.C. Stone put his hand on her shoulders, gave us a right telling off, and threatened to tell her parents. We didn't do it again.
And something about knocking on doors.
Yes, we used to have the occasional, as we went to choir practice, used to get a piece of cotton and tie it to somebody's door knocker in Main Street, rattle it. When they come to the door, we used to run like hell up the village out of the way.
Did you ever own a bike? Or
Yes, I was one of the lucky persons. I used to have a small bike, which then when the war finished, I used to ride up and down the road, nearly wrecked it. But then the people across the road, named Mrs. Hunt and her husband Darcy, bought it for Roger. And now my parents bought me a brand new Hercules bike, and I was the king of the village on that bike. It was green and chrome.
what was your childhood like?
I was the only child, and my parents were very strict. Believe you me, the copper stick and the brush came a bit hard across your legs. And I had to do errands. I had to go where I was told. I had to dig the garden. I wouldn't be allowed out to go and play cricket or football till I'd done my chores.
Did you ever get told off at school?
On a few occasions, yes. On my first day at school, my teacher was Miss Lakin, and she rapped my knuckles for talking. But I think on other occasions I was chastised by Mr. McKnight, but never nothing serious.
When you worked at W.E. Ward's, you were about 17 then?
I was now 15 when I left school. I went as an apprentice carpenter and joiner, and they sent me to Tech, which I started. And unfortunately, it was hard work because the kids that went to Tech in Burton had been to Burton Tech High School, and I hadn't, so they were well in front of me. But time the end, after a 5-year apprenticeship, out of 48 that started, there's only 12 of us took the final exam, and luckily I was one and passed. And after that, I did 2 years national service in the Royal Air Force.
And then where did you go? Did you go back to
I went back to W.E. Ward's and as a carpenter joiner for 18 months. Then, lucky enough, I was advised by a person in the village, why didn't I look to go farther advance and be a clerk of works or building inspector. But lucky enough, in 1963, 64, I was appointed assistant building inspector at Tutbury RDC, which I stayed until 1965, when I was then, I got a post as clerk of works for the Borough of Burton-on-Trent, and one of my big projects was the De Ferriers School, which cost in those days over £1 million to construct.
And you were clerk of the works there?
I was clerk of works, yes.
Yeah.
And when I'd been back to Tech, and I'd got my Institute Clerk of Works exams, plus my Institute, plus sitting girls in building quantities, and my and then I went back farther and got my High National.
Can you tell me anything about the Paul Pryor pub? We haven't got anything about that.
Paul Pryor was obviously, it was a well-known pub. It was a coaching house years ago. I used to, when the coaches came into the village, the male coaches, but the horse coaches these were, there were stables there, and the people stayed overnight in the Paul Pryor, and then on their journey next day on the A38. And also in there was the mortuary, where there was any deceased people through accidents were there, and in the Paul Pryor itself, the coroner held the inquest.
And did you drink in there?
I drunk in there from when I was about 18, 19. We had many a raucous night, and I think I found my way home. Perhaps it was on the hands and knees, but I got home. And also the Crown Inn was one of our favourite haunts.
And who ran the?
The Crown was run by a chap called Stan Coates, and the Paul Pryor was by a name, one name, funny enough, wasn't Shakespeare himself, it was Mr Macbeth. And when he moved out, it was Mr Lloyd who kept it, and his daughter still lives in Barton under Needwood.
There's something about in the Paul Pryor drinking on a Thursday night.
Thursday nights was, I always went, and it was always farmers and builders nights. They all met in there, and they came out way after hours with the policeman watching outside. But in the old days, I remember the policeman used to put his mac over his uniform and come and have a drink with the locals.
Can you tell me anything about Branston factory or
Yeah, during
what
the
it
war,
was?
The ordnance depot at Branston, which produced before the war, Tommy Branston pickles were made there. And they used to have, Hanfords used to have coaches and bring the workers to and from the factory into the village, turn around at the Warmore and go out. And unfortunately one night I was on the back of a horse and cart driven by Jeff Malabar, which the back of the coach touched the cart and the horse bolted, threw me off by opposite W.E. Ward's yard, and I was in hospital unconscious for a week. But to tell the truth, I came round. But in them days, where David Johnson lives, was a sign, a hoarding. They used to have all the adverts on, the big adverts, it was Mills and somebody, and the big hoardings, and they'd advertise soaps or whatever, in my case may be.
And what was it with Jim Leavesley and Le Mans?
Jim Leavesley, if I remember, when Dr Platt was our doctor, he was quite a big friend of Mr Jim Leavesley, and they used to, though they raced at Le Mans with their car, and I've seen Mr Jim Platt, or Dr Platt, reverse down the road quicker than a good many people drove forward. Now, I don't know whether they completed the course, but they did go into it.
And what year would that have been?
I would say in the early to mid-50s.
Where did you actually go swimming?
We went
the village?
in the village. We used to swim along by the quarter-mile bridge in the canal, also in Walkfield and in the River Trent down Staffold Lane.
And finally, did you ever have any nicknames at school?
Oh yes, I did indeed. I don't know how I got them. One was Cliff, one was Tikey, and one was One Note, and of course Kirky, and a lot of people still today still call me Kirky.
What was One Note?
I don't know, it was One Note they used to call me.
Can you sing?
No. I was in the school choir, in the church choir. I could sing with the choir, but I couldn't sing solo. And the organist then and choir lady was Mrs Nelson Ball, who lived in the village a good many years, and she was a school teacher at King's Bromley.
That's it. That's everything. So you've got a few